Tales of Horror and the Supernatural by Arthur Machen. So I had kind of vaguely been aware of Arthur Machen. I knew he was an older writer of horror, and he was very influential to H.P. Lovecraft. And I recently read this book, Masks of the Illuminati by Robert Anton Wilson. And in this novel, they talk about Arthur Machen and a short story he wrote called The Great God Pan. And it becomes kind of a main focal point of the plot of this one. There's similarities between the plot of this book and the plot of The Great God Pan. And it interested me. I really enjoyed that novel, Masks of the Illuminati. And I realized that I had this collection of short stories by Arthur Machen. This is published by Pinnacle Books in 2 parts. And they kind of make a little scene if you put them together. It's pretty cool. So I looked in here, and sure enough, The Great God Pan was in here. And I read that. I really enjoyed it. And it kind of got my attention enough to read the rest of the short stories that are in this collection. And, you know, I did a little bit more research on Arthur Machen. I knew he was a horror writer, like I said, but I didn't realize how much he was interested in the occult. And a lot of these stories kind of blend all of this together. It blends mysticism, religion, occult, pagan idols, all these kinds of things that attempt to kind of break this veil down between reality and some sort of other spiritual dimension in a way. Now, a lot of times these stories are on the darker side of breaking through that veil. And Arthur Machen himself was a very interesting guy. He was a Christian, from what I can tell, but he had a lot of interest in some of these things. He read some book about alchemy, I think, when he was younger, and it made him interested in some of these kind of more mystic things relating to spirituality. He was Welsh, and he lived near some of these pagan sites that got his interest in that as well. And later in his life, he became a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which, if you know anything about that, it kind of adds a whole nother layer to this guy's life. And I don't think he took it too seriously. I don't know how invested he was into that side of things, but in his writing, you can definitely tell he had an interest in all of these strange, bizarre things having to do with the occult and the supernatural. And usually, like the title of these mention, usually it leads to horror. And so in his books, there's usually some kind of average people who are kind of getting sucked into the dark side in a way, almost through circumstance or from their own curiosity. These aren't people with ill intent, and we have both male and female strong characters who kind of just end up looking into something a little too deep, getting sucked into it, and find themselves on the precipice of this abyss, looking down, and sometimes they come out of it and sometimes they don't. It's usually never this like sinister evil that comes from man. It's more of this like curiosity to this knowledge and these ideas that bring people into these situations. And his writing, you know, most of these stories were written, or all of these stories in this collection were written between 1894 and 1936. And I'll put a list here of all the stories that were included in this collection. And I know this collection here might be a little hard to find, but he's definitely in the public domain. You can find his stories all over the place, and there's audiobooks on YouTube and your library, and there's no shortage of Arthur Machen right now. For free consumption. And after reading all of these stories, even though I know he was influenced to people like H.P. Lovecraft, I would say these stories read a bit more like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle than they do like Lovecraft. There are a couple stories that his prose does get pretty ornate and kind of flowery, almost purple, if you will. More on the lines of what Lovecraft ended up writing, but most of his stories are told pretty straightforward. He uses a lot of kind of exposition between characters, so you'll have one character just explaining everything to another character, and that's just kind of the way things were written back then. It never bothered me, but I know that kind of bothers some people. But I think it's worth it if you're into older horror and to see where people like H.P. Lovecraft was influenced, and even Stephen King and Harlan Ellison has even mentioned him in some of the essays that I've read from him. So very influential, ahead of his time, doing some real interesting things. And now I'm just going to go through a few of the stories that I really liked out of this collection. I would say about half of them I really liked. There's definitely half that I didn't like as much and probably wouldn't really recommend. It also seemed like his longer stories seemed to be a little bit better than the shorter ones, with one exception that I'll get to in a minute. But he wrote these, like I said, between 1894 and 1936. So there was some of these stories that had a backdrop of World War I, and the one that is the longest in here is called The Terror, and it was written in 1917. It was just over 100 pages, and it was the last story in this collection that I read, and it definitely had a different feel. When I started reading this, the tone and everything was different about this one, and I really didn't like it at first, but the more I read, the more I really enjoyed it. And it kind of just has to do with this Welsh village right during World War I, and there's these strange occurrences happening, and these townfolk are kind of trying to figure out what's going on. That's kind of the premise of a lot of these stories. But the more you read into this one, it seemed like he really kind of brought up a lot of issues he'd been dabbling with in some of the other stories, and then kind of put it all together in this one. And I think maybe that's why it's the last story they included in this collection. But he really gets into what the nature of reality is. He speculates on all sorts of things through this narrator, this journalist. And there's this idea that through knowledge and science and some things like that humans have kind of lost their touch with the true nature of reality, and animals and the world and everything is still in this set of laws, if you will, but humans have been the ones that have taken themselves out of it. And he explores some very, very interesting themes in that one. Like I said, it is the longest story in the collection, so I think he had a little bit more time to kind of flesh it out, and I really enjoyed that one. Kind of the exception to the rule where I was talking about, there was a story that was only 4 pages long. It's probably one of his most popular stories, and it's called The Bowman. It was written in 1914, and it's very short. I just recommend going out and reading it, but kind of has to do with some British soldiers who kind of have their back against the wall in a way, and they get out of a real bad situation in a very interesting way. Now, next up is the story of the great god Pan. This was written in 1894, and this was a very interesting one. There's some people, a doctor and another guy, who kind of experiment with this woman. She seemed to have a bit of like mental impairments, and they do this very unethical surgery on her to try to break down the veil of reality and allow her to see the world as it really is. And this includes kind of communicating with this great god Pan. Now, this leads to all sorts of issues as our characters are telling these stories about what happens after this lady kind of breaks this veil down. This is the one that had a lot of similarities with the masks of the Illuminati, because there's a lot of unexplained suicides, and there is even more that goes beyond that with kind of unleashing entities that can kind of continue on. And it was really well done. It wasn't my favorite, but it is probably one of his most popular works. It's definitely worth reading. Now, there's two here that I really enjoyed, and I came to find out later they were kind of part of a novel that was put together called The Three Impostors. And I think this was, I don't know if this was originally done as a Ballantine adult fantasy or if they just reprinted it, but that story seems to be a fix-up novel where he took some of his short stories, put them together, and linked them up and put some interludes in between them to connect these stories. But one of the stories is called The Novel of the Black Seal, and this was definitely another inspiration to Lovecraft. With, like, you could see how this was probably sparking ideas in Lovecraft's head for things like the Call of Cthulhu and the Dunwich Horror. This really gets into hidden knowledge, the nature of reality and humanity, and it's a very interesting story. This is a definite read. It's hard to really talk too much about the plots in these stories. You just have to like read them and see where Machen goes with these stories. Now, another short story that's part of that Three Impostors is The Novel of the White Powder. There's a man, and when we say the novel of the white powder, it's not the white powder you're thinking of, but it is a medicine that this guy takes, and he's sort of one of the main characters of this story, but he's kind of in the background the whole time. And he takes this medication, and at first it seems like everything's okay. But his sister is very skeptical about this, and she's really worried about him. Most of the story is kind of revolving around her, and she's the one that kind of raises the white flag here that something's up as this guy locks himself into his room, and things get creepier and creepier, and their thoughts that this white powder is linked to these pagan rituals, and she gets this doctor to come kind of help her out. And in the end, after this horrific thing happens, we get a lot of really interesting commentary, not only from the sister and how she perceives what happens to her brother, but also this doctor. He writes a letter to the sister in the end, and he really kind of sums up what maybe some ideas of occultism and black magic and what some of this stuff is really trying to do. And he writes it in a very concise, easy to digest manner that it was just very interesting to read. So those are probably very popular short stories as well, not only because they've been anthologized all over the place, but they were put into that Three Impostors novel. So the last two I want to talk about here, one is called The Innermost Light, and this involves a kind of detective named Dyson, and he's apparently used in quite a few of Machen's stories, and he's almost like an occult detective, which is a really interesting idea, kind of like the Sherlock Holmes of the occult. And Dyson is kind of introduced to a scientist called Dr. Black, who's imprisoned his wife's soul into a jewel. And while his wife's soul is in this jewel, her body becomes a vessel for something else. This was another really great one, as our occult detective kind of uses his wits to figure out what's going on, and you'll find out what it means for the title of this one, The Innermost Light. So the last story I want to talk about here is called The White People, and it was written in 1904. And in this one, it starts off with two characters kind of discussing the nature of evil. And then one of the characters breaks out this thing he has in his possession, and it's called the Green Book. And this is a diary from a young girl. And then at that point, the narrative kind of switches over and we're kind of reading through this diary from the point of view of this girl. And she, through the aid of a nurse, kind of gets shown this secret underworld, and it's filled with folklore and black magic. And she kind of delves deeper and deeper into this place. It's almost like a labyrinth that she's going down as you read through this diary. And then it kind of ends in a abrupt way, and then we get back to our two characters, and they kind of discuss what the ultimate fate of this girl was. This one was done really well. It was my favorite out of the whole collection. I think it's also a very popular one that he wrote, and it's definitely worth checking out. Yeah, so Arthur Machen was writing a bunch of real interesting stuff a long time ago, inspiring a lot of modern authors, even up to this day, and he seems to be talked about a bit, but maybe not as much as some other authors from this time period. Who knows why that might be? Maybe it's some of the occult things he was dealing with, just kind of maybe he was a little too ahead of his time, who knows? But, let me know if you've read any of his works, and if there's any others that I should read that weren't in this collection. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.